The carcass on line 3 was moving, not swaying, not settling, not the kind of passive shift you get when a chain catches unevenly or the hooks need maintenance. It was moving with the belt, matching it. Every lurch of the conveyor, every mechanical hesitation in the forward pull, the body adjusted, compensated, like something inside it understood the rhythm and was working to stay synchronized with it. I stood at my station and I watched it for almost a full minute before I let myself believe what I was seeing. The cold in that room is a specific kind of cold. It's not the cold of winter outside or the cold of a walk-in freezer in a grocery store. It's the cold of metal and moisture and the particular absence of warmth that sets in when organic matter has been removed from a space that used to hold it. You feel it through your boots, through your gloves, through the back of your collar. It doesn't change regardless of how long you stand there. You never acclimate to it. I noticed that cold more in that moment than I had in any of the 3 weeks leading up to it. The tag on its rear leg read a processing timestamp. I had to look at it twice before I understood what I was reading. The date printed on that tag was not today's date. It wasn't yesterday's date. It was tomorrow's. A shift that hadn't happened yet. A number that had no business being on any tag in that facility at that moment. Across the line, Travis Kellard was pretending not to see it. I could tell by the way he moved. He'd adjusted his pace, stepped slightly off the cadence he normally held, putting just enough irregularity into his movement to break some synchronization I didn't yet have a word for. And he wasn't looking at the carcass, he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at a fixed point on the wall past both of us, and his face held the careful blankness of a man who has made a decision to be somewhere else in his mind. Then the carcass turned its head. Not a full rotation, not a dramatic gesture, just a slight, precise turn, the way an animal will orient toward a sound it wants to locate. It faced me. What was left of its face faced me, and for 1 full second, nothing in that building made any sound at all. That was 6 days into the job. I need to go back to the beginning. I didn't apply for the night shift supervisor position at Platte River Processing Facility. The job came to me the way a lot of things do when you've spent enough time in agricultural processing in the Nebraska corridor. You get a call. Someone knows someone. There's a gap that needs filling and your name is at the top of a short list. I'd spent 11 years in processing facilities of one kind or another, working my way from floor labor to quality control to shift management. I knew the work. I knew the smell. I knew the particular language people use when they've spent enough of their lives around industrial-scale livestock processing that it stops feeling like anything other than a job. The call came from Gordon Ellis Whitcomb, the day manager at Platte River. He had the voice of a man who'd been tired for a very long time and had adjusted his entire personality around the maintenance of that tiredness. Measured, economical. Every word chosen to convey the minimum necessary information. He told me the previous night shift supervisor had left without notice, and he told me the position needed to be filled immediately. He told me the facility ran a standard operation, 12 hours on, 12 off, and that my paperwork would be ready when I arrived. I asked what happened to the previous supervisor. Gordon said, "He stopped showing up." I asked if there was any documentation he'd left behind, anything to brief me on facility-specific procedures. There was a pause on the line, not a long pause, but long enough. "The facility has standard procedures," Gordon said. "You'll pick up the rest as you go." The rest, that was the word he used. Not additional procedures, not site-specific protocols. The rest, as though he were referring to something that already existed and simply hadn't been handed to me yet. I drove down to Dawson County on a Tuesday in late November, and the facility sat on the edge of a flat stretch of land outside Lexington. The kind of flat that Nebraska does so completely that the sky seems too large for the ground beneath it. The building was older than I expected. The exterior walls were that particular shade of faded industrial gray that happens when something has been weathered for decades without being repainted. The parking lot had a fine layer of grit over the asphalt that the wind moved in slow, low patterns. Everything smelled of what it was, wet concrete, the particular mineral edge of processed blood, and below that, something underneath that I clocked immediately and couldn't place. Something organic and cold. Not the smell of the processing itself, but something else using that smell as cover. Gordon met me at the front office. He was a broad man, somewhere past 60, in with the physical stillness of someone who had learned a long time ago not to make unnecessary movements. He shook my hand, looked me in the eyes for exactly long enough to establish that he'd done it, and then looked away. He showed me the floor. The main processing line, the cooling rooms, the loading dock, the sanitation station. He walked me through the shift schedule, the crew assignments, the equipment maintenance log. All of it standard. All of it exactly what you'd expect from a facility of this type and age. He answered every question I asked with a completeness that should have been reassuring. But the facility felt wrong in a way I couldn't locate. It wasn't one thing. It was the accumulation of small things that don't individually register as problems but collectively produce a sensation in the back of your skull that something has been arranged. The machinery ran too smoothly. Not the smoothness of well-maintained equipment, which always has a trace of irregularity to it. The small stutters and variations that tell you you're dealing with mechanical reality. This was smoother than that. This was a regularity that felt intentional in a way machinery shouldn't feel intentional. I noticed the workers adjusting their movements before I understood why. Not dramatically. Nothing you'd clock if you weren't looking for it. A half step left, a slight change in stride length, a pause before reaching across the line, and the kind of micro-corrections you'd attribute to individual work habits if you only watched one person. But I was watching the whole floor and I could see the pattern. Every person on the line was doing some version of the same thing. Quietly, constantly, without apparent awareness of it, they were all moving in ways that avoided something I couldn't yet name. The machinery ran for exactly 3 seconds after Gordon hit the shutdown at the end of the walkthrough. He didn't acknowledge it. He just stood with his hand on the panel until it stopped. And then he turned and walked me back toward the front office without a word. I didn't mention it, but I noted it. That was the first night. By the third night, I was watching the conveyor belt the way you watch water when you're not sure if it's moving. And the belt on the main line ran at a documented speed. There was a posted specification on the wall beside the control panel, the kind of laminated card that accumulates grease around the edges from years of workers pointing at it during briefings. The speed was stated in feet per minute, and the number on that card had presumably been accurate when it was printed. But the belt I was watching didn't run at a fixed speed. It ran at something that felt like a fixed speed the way a heartbeat feels like a fixed rhythm, which is to say it varied within a range so narrow that only sustained attention would catch it. Travis Kellard caught it from the first minute of every shift. Travis was the senior line worker on nights, and he had the physical composure of a man who'd spent years developing a specific kind of calm, and not the calm of someone who has nothing to worry about. The calm of someone who has decided exactly how to worry and is doing it continuously beneath a surface of professional functionality. He was in his mid-40s, deliberate in every movement, and he walked off beat. Always. Every step he took on that floor had a slight irregularity to it, a small but consistent disruption to whatever natural pace he might have settled into. On the fourth night, I tested something. I walked a section of the line matching my pace to the belt. Not dramatically, just letting my steps fall into the same rhythm as the conveyor, the way you might unconsciously fall into step with someone walking beside you. I did it for about 30 seconds. The belt slowed, not by much, Enough that if you weren't watching the hanging carcasses against a fixed reference point, you'd never catch it. But I was watching, and it slowed in the specific way that something slows when it's adjusting to an input, not when it's experiencing mechanical resistance. I broke the rhythm immediately, took 3 off-tempo steps and moved away from the line entirely. Behind me, a carcass that had been absolutely still shifted, just slightly. One hind leg swung a half arc that had nothing to do with the momentum of the hook above it. I didn't turn back around for almost a minute. When I did, everything was still. I asked Travis casually at the shift break whether the belt speed had ever been recalibrated. He looked at me the way people look at you when they're deciding how much to tell you. And he had a coffee cup he wasn't drinking from, and he turned it slowly in his hands. "You want to walk off beat," he said. "I don't mean during an emergency, I mean always, whenever you're near the line." I asked why. He looked at the cup. "You'll figure out why." That was the first thing anybody said to me that acknowledged something was different about this place. Not an explanation, not a warning, a direction delivered in the matter-of-fact tone of someone passing along operational knowledge. Walk off beat. I didn't ask him anything else that night. What I'd already understood was enough to carry. A week into the shift, I found an item at the far end of line 3 that didn't belong to any batch I'd logged. The first thing I noticed was the warmth of it, which sounds like a small thing until you understand what the cooling room does to everything that passes through it. Processed material that's been through the full cycle is cold, not room temperature, not slightly cool, but the specific deep cold of something that's had heat extraction applied to it for the appropriate duration. This item had not reached that temperature. When I touched it with my gloved hand, I could feel the warmth through the insulation. The tag was absent. No processing timestamp, no batch code, no identification of any kind. I was reaching for the incident log when Marla Jean Pritchett stepped beside me with the quiet efficiency of someone who has done exactly this many times before. She was the sanitation crew lead, a woman in her early 50s who moved through that facility with a thorough knowledge of every surface and drain. She reached past me and removed the item from the line without hesitation, without gloves and without logging anything. "That one's not done yet," she said. I asked what that meant, not done in what sense. She looked at me with an expression that had patience in it, but also something else. Something that was doing the math on how much to give me. "Some things come back through before they're finished," she said. "You don't log those, you don't count them, you let me handle them." I asked how long that had been the practice. Marla paused with the item held away from her body, not distastefully, but with the practiced positioning of someone who knew exactly how to carry it. "How long have you been on this shift?" she asked. She didn't wait for my answer. She walked toward the far drainage corridor with the item held carefully, and I stood at the end of line 3 long enough to understand that a question had been redirected back at me in a way that was not accidental. I had been on this shift for 9 days at that point. I have thought about her question almost every day since. The rule about the drainage level wasn't written anywhere, but I'd heard it referenced in fragments during the first week. Don't go down alone, not at night, not during processing hours. The way it got mentioned had the quality of something so basic it barely needed saying. The way you don't explain to someone new that they shouldn't walk into moving machinery. It was assumed knowledge, foundational. On the 11th night, I went down anyway. I want to be clear about why, yet it wasn't recklessness. I've been in enough facilities to understand that informal rules accumulate around genuine hazards, and the only way to understand what the hazard actually is involves going to look at it. I'd been building a picture of this place from fragments, and the drainage level was a gap in that picture I needed to close. The access stairs were in a maintenance corridor past the cooling room. The air changed before I reached the bottom. It got warmer, which was wrong. Drainage levels in processing facilities run cold. They're wet and they're low, and they get whatever thermal regulation the floors above them passively provide, which in a cooling adjacent facility means they trend cold. This one didn't. The smell was the other thing. The surface facility smelled of disinfectant and cold metal and the industrial processing underneath both. Down here, the disinfectant smell was absent. What was left was something damp and deep and mineral, like the inside of a place where water has been sitting for a very long time undisturbed. And beneath that, something I can only describe as biological in a way that processing facilities shouldn't be. Not the biological smell of the work being done upstairs. Something else. Something that belonged to something that was still, for a lack of a better word, ongoing. The drainage channels were in operation. I don't mean they were wet, I mean the material moving through them was moving with direction and purpose that had nothing to do with gravity or runoff. I stood on the walkway above the central channel and I watched the material that was flowing through it. And after about 30 seconds, I stopped thinking of it as flowing and started thinking of it as moving because the distinction mattered. Flowing is passive. This wasn't passive. There were formations in the channel that I watched for almost 2 minutes before I let myself categorize what I was seeing. The material was rearranging itself, slowly, incrementally, without any visible mechanism. It was organizing into shapes that had internal structure. Not animal shapes, not recognizable forms, but structure. The kind of structure that implies a blueprint somewhere, even if you can't see the blueprint. Then I heard the sound. It was low and rhythmic, and it came from below the channel floor, and which meant it came from below the lowest level of the facility. A sound that resembled breathing the way that a mechanical pump resembles a heartbeat. Regular, humid, patient. I left. I want to be precise about this. I didn't run. I turned around and I walked back up the stairs at the pace of someone who has decided that moving faster would be an acknowledgement of something they're not ready to acknowledge. I walked back through the maintenance corridor and I stood in the cooling room for about 5 minutes doing nothing except breathing the cold air and listening to the machinery above me. The drainage level was not connected to any machinery in the facility blueprint I'd been given. Whatever was moving through those channels was moving under its own direction. That detail seemed minor in the moment, as I have not stopped thinking about it. 2 nights later, the duplicate tags appeared. I was doing a routine batch check on line 2 when I found them. 2 carcasses, adjacent hooks separated by about 6 feet of line. Both tagged with identical identification numbers, identical timestamps, identical batch designations. I assumed a printing error at first. Equipment does fail, labels get duplicated, it's not unheard of in any production facility. Then I looked at the 2 items more carefully. They were identical, not similar, not from the same lot with natural variation between them. Identical in a way that made the back of my neck produce a sensation I don't have a clinical word for. The same weight distribution on the hook, the same precise geometry of what the processing had left behind, and the same specific wear pattern in exactly the same location on both rear shanks. I stood there for what was probably 45 seconds without moving. Then I reached for both tags and pulled both items from the line. The machinery hesitated, 1 full beat, maybe a second and a half. The belt slowed, the overhead chains tightened slightly, and then everything resumed at normal pace as though nothing had interrupted it. But that hesitation was a response. I understood that immediately. The system had registered a removal, weighed something against it, and continued. It had done the calculation and decided to keep going. I logged neither item. I didn't know what I would have written. The rules I was learning weren't written anywhere in the facility documentation. They existed in the space between what people did and what they didn't do, and in the specific quality of how certain subjects were not mentioned, in the adjustments Travis made to his stride and the items Marla removed without logging, and the way Gordon always stood with his hand on the shutdown panel for those 3 extra seconds. They weren't rules anyone had sat me down to explain. They were the residue of a much longer relationship between this facility and the people who worked in it. A relationship that had been establishing its terms for a very long time before I arrived. The rules were not safety procedures. I understood that on the night I found the duplicate tags. Safety procedures are designed to protect workers from the system. These rules were designed to protect the system from disruption. There's a difference, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. And the Slaughterhouse wasn't running a process with some unusual safety requirements. It was maintaining a balance. Everything I'd been observing, the belt adjustments, the unlogged returns, the drainage level, the duplicate tags, all of it pointed to the same shape. The surface operation and the subsurface operation were running in tandem. Material went down from above, processed and standard, and whatever was below used it. And whatever was below wasn't just consuming it. It was building something from it and sending pieces of that construction back up. The returns Marla handled weren't errors in the system. They were outputs of it. The carcass with the future-dated tag wasn't a processing mistake. It was something the system had produced and reintroduced into the line, already tagged for the next cycle, already part of a sequence I couldn't fully trace because the sequence extended below the lowest level of the facility, and I was only seeing its upper surface. Workers who had been here long enough had adapted their behavior to support this. Not through formal training, through the slow accumulation of consequences for doing things wrong and the equally slow accumulation of understanding when you did things right. Walk off beat. Don't report movement after inspection. Always leave one item unprocessed. If the machinery continues after shutdown, stay in place. Don't go below alone. Discard both items if you see the same tag twice. The rules weren't protecting us from the ecosystem below. The rules were what kept the exchange orderly. Cody Blake Henshaw started on the floor on a Thursday, and Gordon brought him through the same walkthrough I'd received with the same measured economy of language, the same deliberate omissions. Cody was in his mid-20s, which is to say he was at the age where confidence in physical competence hasn't yet been worn into appropriate caution. He moved through the facility at full, natural pace. He asked clear, practical questions. He positioned himself at the line without any of the micro-adjustments that every other worker on that floor performed as automatically as breathing. I watched him for the first 2 hours of his shift the way I'd watched everything else in that facility, waiting for the system to register his presence the way it had registered mine. It didn't. Cody walked directly in rhythm with the belt for a full pass downline one while helping me with a batch transfer. And he wasn't doing it deliberately, he just walked at a natural pace, and his natural pace happened to align with the conveyor and nothing happened. The belt didn't slow. Nothing on the line shifted or adjusted. A carcass that had been doing its small, subtle thing, that particular near imperceptible movement I'd learned to track, went completely still as he passed it. I kept moving and said nothing. Later in the shift, I watched Cody step in rhythm with the belt again, this time for several consecutive seconds near the middle section of line 2. I tracked every carcass in his immediate radius. None of them responded. The machinery maintained its exact documented speed without any of the organic adjustment I'd come to understand as the system's mode of attention. He was invisible to it. I spent the rest of that shift working out why. By the end of it, I had the best answer I was going to get. The rules weren't universal behaviors that protected everyone from the system. They were behaviors specific to people the system had already registered. You had to be noticed first before the rules applied to you. The rules were how you maintained a relationship once the relationship had been established. Cody hadn't been noticed yet, which meant either the system eventually noticed everyone who spent enough time here or there was something specific that initiated the registration. A behavior, a proximity, a threshold of time. I didn't know which. What I knew was that I'd been visible to it from somewhere in my first week, and that visibility had never lifted. I now believe the previous supervisor didn't disappear. I believe he was removed from the cycle, not violently, and not dramatically. Just at some point what the system needed from him was complete, and the relationship resolved in whatever direction these relationships resolve. And Gordon knew that, and Gordon called my name from a short list because the list needed someone with enough experience to adapt quickly, and enough institutional baseline to follow procedures without asking the wrong questions. Gordon had been maintaining this system longer than I had been working in processing facilities. I need to tell you what I tried to do on the second to last night. I matched my pace to the belt. I walked in full sync with it for 60 seconds. I then walked to the control panel and wrote a notation in the incident log about the carcass I'd seen move on night 3. I then processed every single item in the current batch without leaving one behind, and the system destabilized. Not catastrophically, nothing fell, nothing broke, no emergency triggered. But the facility produced in the span of about 4 minutes a sequence of responses that I can only describe as a system encountering unexpected inputs. The belt stuttered, not the mechanical irregularity of equipment failure. A stutter that moved through the line in a wave, the kind of wave that moves through water when something beneath the surface changes direction. The overhead chains made a sound that was different from their normal clanking. Lower, more resonant, like the sound a bridge makes when its tension changes. And from below, through the floor, I felt a vibration that hadn't been there before. Then it stopped. Not gradually, completely, the belt resumed its documented speed, the chains returned to their normal register, and the vibration ceased, and the facility was still and operational and running in all observable ways exactly as it should. But I felt the shift in it. The quality of the stillness that followed was different from the quality of the stillness before I disrupted it. Something had been recalibrated. The system had absorbed what I'd done and had found a new equilibrium that accounted for it. It couldn't be stopped. I understood that with the particular clarity you get when something that should work doesn't, and you're honest enough with yourself to recognize why. The ecosystem below the slaughterhouse was not a parasite that had attached itself to the facility's operations. It was not a malfunction or an infestation or an anomaly that had persisted through institutional neglect. It was the other half of what this facility actually was. And the livestock processing was real and industrial and entirely functional. It was also, from the perspective of whatever lived below, a delivery mechanism. The facility above fed the system below. The system below produced returns that re-entered the facility above. The loop had been running since the building was built, and it had been running with the active participation of every worker who had stayed long enough to become integrated into it. The rules didn't protect us from the system. We were the system's nervous system. Every behavior we'd adopted, every micro-adjustment, every unlogged item and unreported movement and 3-second wait after shutdown was the system regulating itself through us. We were its interface, its maintenance protocol. And the biological components of a process that was partly mechanical and partly something else. Something I don't have the scientific vocabulary to name, that had been using the industrial processing facility as its upper level since the day the first machine was installed. I thought about the carcass with the tomorrow-dated tag. I thought about the warm item Marla had carried from the line without gloves. I thought about the breathing sound below the drainage channels. I thought about Gordon's hand on the shutdown panel and his 3-second pause, every time, without fail, and the way he had never explained it and had never needed to. I thought about the previous supervisor and the short list of names and the specific quality of Gordon's voice when I'd asked what happened to the man before me. He stopped showing up, which means at some point the system had finished with him. or he had refused the next stage of what the system needed from him. And those two things might not be different events at all. That was when I understood what it was costing me. Not my safety, not my physical integrity. I was standing in the facility, fully functional, and nothing about the system had moved toward me with any apparent hostility. The cost was something more specific than safety. I could no longer perceive the facility as a place that processed livestock. I could see the upper loop and I could sense the lower loop, and I understood their relationship, and that understanding had replaced a way of seeing that I would never get back. I couldn't look at a processing line without understanding it as the top half of a larger operation. I couldn't see organic material moving through a facility without understanding it as resource management for something I'd only glimpsed through a drainage channel floor. The world in which industrial processing was just industrial processing had closed behind me somewhere in my first week, and the door to it had sealed. What replaced it was more specific, more real. But it was a reality I had not chosen and could not return from. Whether knowing it was worth what it cost, I still haven't resolved that. On my final shift, I trained Cody. I walked him through the equipment, the maintenance logs, the batch documentation procedures. I showed him how to read the belt speed posting and how to use the incident log. I was thorough and accurate about all of it. I told him to walk off beat near the line, not during emergencies, always. I told him that if the machinery ran after shutdown, he should stay in place until it stopped. I told him that if he ever found an item at the end of the line without proper tagging, he should find Marla. I did not tell him why. I didn't tell him about the drainage level. I didn't tell him about the duplicate tags and what removing both of them causes. I didn't explain what the 3-second wait at shutdown was protecting. I gave him the behaviors without the architecture, the same way they'd been passed to me and the same way they'd been passed to whoever had them before me. At the end of the shift, I walked to the parking lot. I stopped at the edge of the building where the exterior drainage access panel is mounted in the foundation wall, and I stood there for a moment in the cold and the dark and the particular mineral smell of that ground. Then I walked to my truck and started the engine. I watched the facility through the windshield for a few minutes before I pulled away. The lights were on inside. The line was running. Through the exterior wall, faint and rhythmic and entirely patient, I could hear the machinery. I pulled out of the lot and drove north. I was about a mile out when I thought about Cody at the line, about whether the system had registered him yet, or whether he was still invisible to it, or whether the invisible period was already over and I just hadn't been there to see the moment it ended. I thought about the way the carcass near line 2 had gone still when he passed it, and whether that stillness was the system ignoring him or the system deciding about him. I don't check the rearview mirror more than I used to. That part of me is fine. But I do something now, when I walk into any large building for the first time, that I didn't do before. I listen for machinery that shouldn't still be running. I notice whether the floor feels slightly too warm or too wet, or whether the smell underneath the industrial smell has something underneath it that the industrial smell is trying to cover. I pay attention to how the workers move, whether they match the rhythm of whatever systems are in operation around them, or whether they've learned to stay off beat. Most large facilities are exactly what they appear to be, but some of them have a lower level, and the people who know about it never fully explain what they know, and they hand you the behaviors and let the understanding come later, because the understanding is the part that changes you, and some things can only be passed person to person, shift to shift, one last employee to one new hire, in a building that's been running longer than anyone currently working in it has been alive. I left Platte River on a Wednesday morning in December. By Thursday night, Cody was running the shift alone. When I drove past on Saturday, the lights were on and the machinery was running and everything appeared from the road exactly as it should. I kept driving. I have not gone back to check what the machinery sounds like when it runs after shutdown now. I'm not certain I want to know whether it still pauses for 3 seconds or whether Cody has learned to wait for it.